It's February 20th, 2022. Somewhere deep inside of the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin is about to make one of the most important decisions in post-Cold War history. The fate of Europe is up in the air. For the past 3 months, Russia has been slowly building up troops and materiel along its traditional borders with Ukraine, its annexed Crimean territory, and also in Belarus. Geopolitical tensions are on the rise, due to some combination of Russian anger over NATO expansion, waning Russian influence in Ukraine, or concerns about the long-term sustainability of Russian-occupied Crimea. The United States, for one, is convinced that Russia will invade. Ukraine is desperately trying to downplay expectations that a war will occur. And Russia? Well, officially, Moscow isn't even acknowledging that a mobilization is occurring. But in fact, all of Putin's pieces are in place. And on this day, February 20th, he will tell his generals to begin final preparations for an attack. The die is cast. The invasion will begin 4 days later. What Putin does not yet realize is that his main intelligence organizations have collectively dropped the ball. Within weeks, it will become clear that Putin had made a major mistake. Russia would not turn this war into a cakewalk. And if Russia does finish the war with any material gains, perhaps from capturing grain fields, or manufacturing, or whatever, the substantial costs of fighting will offset any of those benefits. The deeper question, however, is why? Why did Vladimir Putin, a former KGB intelligence officer, who before 2022 was well regarded for his political sharpness, as sharp as these pencils, make such a colossal error? This is the story of Putin's miscalculation. Prologue. Putin's rise to power. In the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it became fashionable to blame the situation on some fundamental part of Russian culture. However, this story is actually about Russia's institutional core rotting and its democratic backsliding. The saga began on December 31st, 1999, shortly before the turn of the millennium, with Putin's rise to power. Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia since its founding in 1991, stepped down. Putin became acting president. 3 months later, Russians cast their ballots to decide what would happen next. The Putin choice was a popular one. He beat his next closest opponent by 24 percentage points, and won almost every constituent part of the Federation. Acting President Putin was now just regular President Putin. Putin won re-election in 2004, but ran into a problem in 2008, the Russian Constitution. Russian presidents cannot serve more than 2 terms consecutively. It was, in theory, time for him to walk away. But the Constitution wasn't a real problem. Behind the scenes, Putin was quietly eliminating any sort of institutions that could challenge him. He also captured the media. Virtually everything was state-run, pro-Putin, or no longer on the air. Freedom of the press was no more. The Soviet Union and communism were long gone, but autocracy was once again returning to the motherland. Without any challengers, but still wanting to keep up outward appearances, Putin willingly left the office of the president. Dmitry Medvedev was sworn into office in his place. But rather than go and live a quiet life on a dacha fit for a Russian founding father, and spend the rest of his days fishing, Putin instead sidled into the prime minister's position. On paper, Medvedev was in charge. In practice, it was Putin all along. Furthermore, Article 81, Section 3 of the Constitution only prohibits 3 consecutive terms. It does not say anything about 3 non-consecutive terms. Putin therefore shifted back into the presidency in 2012, and this time, thanks to a constitutional reform, it was for a 6-year term. Given all of the control he was exerting, Putin unsurprisingly won a 4th term overall in 2018. But the same institutions, or lack of institutions, that had kept Putin in power for more than 22 years were about to cause Russia's undoing. Act 1. The FSB sets the stage. Soon after Putin won the 2018 election, he set his sights on extending Russia's reach into Ukraine. Part of this was to push back against Western expansion in Eastern Europe. Part of this was to specifically stop the post-Maidan revolution shift in Ukrainian politics toward the European Union and NATO and away from Russia. And part of this likely was to feed Putin's desire for historical comparisons to Peter the Great. At the time, Putin began examining the plausibility of using a war to accomplish those goals. That meant consulting the FSB. After the Soviet Union disintegrated, so too did the KGB, its main intelligence service. An interim agency temporarily held its place until the Federal Security Service, or FSB, was founded in 1995. Regarding the Ukraine issue, the FSB was responsible for answering two questions. First, how would the West, and international community more generally, respond to a Russian invasion? And second, would Ukrainians resist Russian soldiers or treat them as liberators? Regarding the West, it was well known in Moscow that the US and its partners supported Ukraine, at least in broad strokes, and were happy with the 2014 Maidan revolution that sent then-President Viktor Yanukovych scrambling to Russia. But there was skepticism about just how much the United States and others were willing to pay in support of the Ukrainian cause. And if the West was not going to care, certainly China, India, and the rest of the world would not either. Back in 2014, when it became clear that a pro-Europe government was going to take hold in Kyiv, Russia quickly scrambled to annex the Crimean Peninsula. This was a major turn of events. Since World War II, there has been a strong international norm against unilateral changes in territory. It's even enshrined in the UN Charter. Article 2, Section 4 instructs member states to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. More relevant to the specific discussion at hand, Russia had signed the Budapest Memorandum back in 1994, in part promising to uphold the existing border, in exchange for Ukraine signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In sum, Crimea was the largest violation of territorial integrity in recent memory. And the West? Well, the West mostly just sat there and told Putin he was being a bad person. There was the standard economic sanctions package that you would expect under the circumstances. Specific people in Russia, those that might have influence with Putin, were personally targeted. But nothing here approached how the United States reacted to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, or what the Western response in February 2022 would look like. And the West certainly did nothing that would significantly disrupt major industries like aerospace manufacturing. There were some punishments, of course. Russia did get kicked out of the G8, leaving us with the G7 that we have today. The United Nations General Assembly also passed Resolution 68-262 on the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which condemned the action. But no matching resolution passed through the Security Council, because Russia has veto power there. In other words, Russia hardly blinked at its punishment. Further, the time between 2014 and 2022 only indicated weaker resolve from the West. Arms transfers to Ukraine remained a critical policy question in the intervening years. At the time, they were intended for the war in Donbass, but now retrospectively, they would have been helpful against a general invasion. Regardless, the arms were not forthcoming. During the Trump administration, transfers became politically polarized and were connected to the scandal that led to Trump's first impeachment. Meanwhile, Germany appeared to be leaning toward the reset button in its relations with Russia. Having previously worked with Russia to build and open the Nord Stream 1 pipeline in October 2011, Germany was ready to forgive and forget, or at least just forget, and work toward completion of the Nord Stream 2, albeit with less enthusiasm. Gerhard Schroeder, Angela Merkel's predecessor, continued to work on the board of the Nord Stream's joint stock company. Merkel in particular became publicly skeptical about US sanctions that interfered with German energy policy. And as the war approached, the West's response was disjointed and distant, to say the least. From Russia's perspective, this was a sign that the West could not agree on whether Ukraine was worth standing firm on. In reality, the West's disagreement mostly stemmed from debate on whether Putin would be bold enough to even try. Russian intelligence had gotten the first question wrong. The other major FSB failure was in its assessment of Ukraine's resolve. Russian intelligence knew that the invasion would not be as simple as the Crimean cakewalk from 2014. No other Ukrainian region had a history of autonomy, and even the 1991 independence votes in Luhansk and Donetsk, the sites of the Russian-sponsored separatist wars that began in 2014, overwhelmingly supported freedom from Moscow. But there was hope in Russia that Ukrainian regional fractionalization would help, which dated back to the 2004 and 2010 presidential elections. Pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych, the same leader who would later flee to Russia, received 49% of the overall vote in the latter election, but primarily drew his support from the East. With the 2014 Maidan Revolution sweeping power back toward pro-Western politicians, perhaps Russia could play the role as a savior to those in the East. That, at the very least, would make Russia's life easier as it fought to secure a land bridge to Crimea. Zelensky's victory in 2019 had much broader support, but his popularity had waned in the intervening years. Moreover, Russia appeared to have no end of willing collaborators in Ukraine, giving Russian military planners a list of targets and post-war planners a base to create a new government. It got so bad that Zelensky would later fire the head of Ukraine's internal security service in July 2022. Russia had also hoped that Zelensky himself would be a source of weakness. Perhaps Zelensky, calculating his poor odds, and, in Russia's eyes, being more of an actor than a politician, and whose party was named after his TV show, would flee to the West and begin a government in exile. More broadly, Russia's dream was that the invasion of Ukraine would look something like the 2003 Iraq War. Major combat operations in Iraq only lasted a few weeks. Iraqi soldiers were quick to desert, due to a combination of them thinking that Saddam Hussein was not a leader who was worth defending, and the belief that resistance was futile. That left just Saddam loyalists for the US-led coalition to mop up, which did not take long. All Russia had to worry about was a long drawn-out insurgency, if this theory was right. In fact, the United States worried about just this sort of outcome, focusing last-minute training to Ukrainians on how to maximize an insurgency's effectiveness. But even then, that would not have been the end of the world for Russia. Remember, Putin led an autocratic government and spent his early years securing control over the media. A slow trickle of casualties is easier to hide under those circumstances, unlike the United States' experience in Afghanistan and Iraq. Moreover, Moscow had shown the ability to weather long insurgencies before. The Soviet Union spent almost all of the 1980s combating an insurgent challenge to Afghanistan's government before finally departing. And although that turned out to be politically untenable in the very long run, Ukraine was different. It is a part of Russia's near abroad, and was under Moscow's direct control only a few decades prior. The average Russian would be willing to pay a lot more for long-term control of Kyiv than Kabul. Act 2. The military's confirmation. Putin was not getting any better advice from his generals. On paper, this was not much of a fight. Though, to be fair, getting clear data on military capabilities is difficult. That is kind of how we got here in the first place. And it is even further difficult to ascertain a specific country's estimates about a rival's capacity. But at the time, Russia appeared to believe that it dominated Ukraine on just about all quantifiable metrics. Gross domestic product, $1.8 trillion for Russia, $200 billion for Ukraine. Active military personnel, 1 million versus 209,000. Reserves, 2 million versus 900,000. Annual military spending, $62 billion for Russia, $6 billion for Ukraine. Tanks, 3,400 versus 1,000. Combat aircraft, 1,400 versus just 100. To be clear, these discrepancies are overstated a bit. Ukraine's only geopolitical rival is Russia, and Belarus by extension, so all of its forces and materiel were pointed in that direction. In contrast, Russia could not simply deploy all of its military strength to the Ukrainian theater. Instead, Moscow's planners had to hold back most of its power to prevent opportunism from Finland, the Baltic states, the United States and NATO more broadly, and Georgia. And let's not forget about China and Japan on the other side of Eurasia. Regardless, Russia was proud of the modernized arsenal it had built. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, William Burns, who had since become director of the CIA, traveled to Moscow in November of 2021 to ascertain what the Kremlin had planned to do with everything on the border. The subject of the meeting turned to Russia boasting about its shiny new military, free from the Soviet legacy that tainted its birth. Of course, it's always a good idea to take state-to-state communication with a grain of salt. The incentive to exaggerate one's own coercive capability is high. Nevertheless, at least in this case, Kremlin officials seemed to believe what they were saying. But perhaps the most compelling cause of the Kremlin's confidence was what had been happening over the last 8 years in Ukraine. The Crimean annexation was a clean operation that made Putin feel like a geopolitical mastermind. Kyiv was such a mess that the government hardly responded. But Russia also made a play in eastern Ukraine by sponsoring separatist movements in Luhansk and Donetsk. Though Russia was not officially participating, few doubt that Putin unofficially signed the orders to send unmarked Russian soldiers, humorously known as little green men for their uniforms and lack of flag patches, to fight against Kyiv's troops. By 2022, the war in Donbass had reached a stalemate. Oddly, this seemed like a positive sign for Moscow. Ukraine had racked up the casualties over the years, and a stalemate kept the separatist capitals alive. Furthermore, Russia was doing this while essentially fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Without official Russian support, there were no air operations going on in the Donbass. The Kremlin could just imagine how successful Russian armed forces would be if they launched a traditional invasion. Furthermore, Moscow predicted a quick victory thanks to Ukrainian collaborators. The plan called for a rapid hit to Ukraine's air defenses, in part revealed by those collaborators, which would allow Russia to obtain complete dominance in the skies. That would then allow for smooth sailing into Kyiv. Timetables given to the invading soldiers had the expectation that they would arrive between 3 p.m. and midnight on the first day. Russia was not alone with these optimistic assessments. Despite being spot on in guessing Russia's intention to invade, U.S. intelligence incorrectly believed that Russia would win the war in short order. Even 2 days before the invasion began, the United States remained pessimistic. Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba, toured Washington, D.C., searching for some final support. In a meeting with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, the U.S. remained focused on crafting an insurgency, believing that Ukraine was ill-prepared for a traditional Russian invasion. And there is an alternative world where Russia's expectations would have been at least somewhat vindicated. As we have discussed before, Russia was just one airport battle away from making the war look very different than it does today. All Russia had to do was use it as a base to go into Kyiv, produce some shock and awe, and watch the remaining organized resistance elsewhere in Ukraine fold up and quit. Again, there was recent historical precedent for this. Part of the reason that the US-backed Afghani government fell apart so quickly back in 2022 is that the Afghan soldiers believed that defeat was inevitable. So why bother? Little did Putin realize, though, he was about to get hit with a cold dose of reality. Interlude. Pravda. Pravda, the Russian word for truth, was the official newspaper of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The irony of the name was not lost on anyone back then. And even in 2022, the news Putin was receiving was far from being Pravda. The West may have been tepid about Crimea, but a land invasion in Europe was a true red line. The apparent dissension within NATO states was less about a full willingness to support Ukraine, and more about a difference in opinions from their respective intelligence agencies about whether Putin was serious. The Ukrainian resolve issue was just a complete misreading. Zelensky was willing to fight, and the Ukrainian people were ready to rally around the flag. Undoubtedly, some within the FSB were skeptical of the official reports. The problem for Putin was that his autocratic system had created sycophants. And once more, we can turn to Saddam Hussein to provide an excellent historical illustration of the issue. Far from an apparently happy family man, he is infamous for murdering contrarian advisors, sometimes even before the person in question could leave the building. Obviously, this is a terrible way to get good information. Advisors start playing a guessing game of what the leader wants to hear rather than transmit information about the truth. Worse yet, advisors have no incentive to put in the hours to figure out what the actual good advice would be. If they are never going to tell the leader bad news anyway, why bother learning the Pravda? This may seem crazy from a leader's perspective, as eventually it will cause the leader to make major policy mistakes. Nevertheless, a leader's desire to repress potential challengers can take precedence, which is something that Moscow has a long tradition of favoring. Speaking out against the preferred policy will draw a leader's scrutiny, as doing so marks the advisor as a potential challenger. And even if the advisor has no inherent interest in mounting a challenge, now they are on the record as having a dissenting opinion. That could be a problem. Imagine that the leader pursues what everyone ultimately learns as a terrible idea, say, undergoing an invasion that was supposed to be easy. The public may become angry and demand changes at the top. Now whichever of these advisors was the contrarian becomes an obvious replacement candidate. Unlike Iraq, and despite Putin's best efforts, Russia has some functional institutions. Killing advisors in the middle of a meeting for disobedience, Saddam Hussein style, is not an option. But dissenting voices are liable to have nasty accidents down long flights of stairs or outside of windows. As a result, any of those contrarian viewpoints from the FSB were unlikely to reach the surface. The Russian military had not provided better guidance. In contrast to earlier, though, this was less about drawing the wrong inference and more about systemic rot. Soldiers in every country have incentive to be lazy, and that includes in Western militaries. If your contribution to the system is minimal, and no one is going to call you out for slacking off, why bother putting in the effort at all? This attitude permeates the Russian military from top to bottom, and it is easier to just go along with the system rather than disrupt the corrupt harmony. What separates Russia from other countries here again is its institutions. Imagine that the US Army was a giant paper tiger, with nothing actually working properly despite billions of dollars spent on it. And the fault is just about everyone. Top to bottom, there is a rotten culture of laziness. Do you know who would love to hear more about that? The media. It would be the biggest scoop of the year. Headline news for weeks. And all it would take is a handful of soldiers who care about the US military's weakness and want to see reforms. But US secretaries, generals, privates, and everyone in between is well aware of that. This, in turn, keeps everyone in line. In theory, autocratic governments could have similar media oversight. The problem is that unregulated media can turn critical of the government. And given how important coordinating expectations is for protesters to succeed, if an autocratic government wants to control one thing beyond just the military, it's the media. Long ago, Putin had decided to fall on the anti-media side of things, only engaging with the press in controlled settings like this one. But come February 2022, he was about to experience the downside of media capture. Ukraine knew there was a possibility that the Russian military was a disaster, and turned to its Foreign Intelligence Service, the SZRU, to investigate further. In the weeks prior to the invasion, the SZRU dispatched agents into Russia to infiltrate military installations. One team reported having observed tank after tank after tank preparing for something, but the mechanics necessary to service those tanks were nowhere in sight. The tanks were just sitting there, left to rust. And the soldiers who were around were more interested in selling anything they could, Russian military property or otherwise, so they could buy more alcohol. Not exactly the portrait of readiness that defines the military at Moscow's parades, and far from the shiny and modern army that Putin thought he had. Act 3. Putin pulls the trigger. Of course, Putin was not privy to the Pravda we know today. He wasn't even privy to everything Ukraine knew about his own military. While it is easy to chalk up the mistake that he was about to make due to some sort of irrational behavior or anger we cannot observe, it is more likely that Putin's miscalculation was a natural consequence of the institutional structures that he intentionally created decades ago. Remember, in a past life, Putin was an agent within the KGB. He knew firsthand of the perverse incentive structures that autocratic regimes create. He also knew that whatever the Russian military was claiming likely exaggerated its true strength. After all, everyone in Russia, from power players in Moscow to ice fishers in Serbia, was aware that lying was pervasive within the Russian bureaucracy. So what sent Putin down the wrong path? There were 4 central culprits that clearly played a role, and maybe a 5th. First, what he was about to do was not completely crazy at the time. All policymakers, Putin, Biden, or whoever, have to operate in a world of uncertainty. Each of the 3 incorrect inferences that Putin made, Western ambivalence, lack of Ukrainian resolve, and a strong Russian military, was plausible at the time. Second, for the operation to truly backfire, Putin would have to encounter a confluence of bad luck. For Russia to encounter any serious problems in Ukraine, the intelligence would have to be wrong on all 3 fronts simultaneously. Did Russia's military suffer from a variety of logistical problems? Maybe. But if Ukraine was going to quickly pull down their flags and fold like the Iraqi army did 2 decades earlier, none of those problems would have actually come to the surface. And if Ukraine stood by their leader and fought back against a hollowed-out Russian army, well, Russia was still a much larger manufacturer of basically everything, weapons included. Moreover, given the slow rate of Western response for the war in Donbass, Ukraine's access to cutting-edge military equipment was lacking. Unless that changed because of a 3rd miscalculation, Russian manufacturing would eventually win the day. In other words, for Russia to encounter serious trouble with its invasion, the Pravda needed to be that Russia had an embarrassing army, and that Ukraine would not simply concede due to indifference, and that the West would endure the economic hardship that would come with supporting the target of Russia's invasion. And even with all of those miscalculations, about a year into the war, Russia would still be capable of controlling almost all of Luhansk, about half of Donetsk, the southern tier of Zaporizhia, and Kherson south of the Dnipro River, thereby completing its land bridge into Crimea. Suddenly, the extent of Putin's miscalculation is not so ridiculous. And yes, it was possible that these errors were correlated. For example, conditional on miscalculating Ukrainian resolve, miscalculating the Western reaction was more likely, perhaps because many of the same yes men overlapped in creating both of those assessments. But even still, from Putin's perspective, the odds of being wrong on all 3 simultaneously were notably lower than being wrong on just one. The 3rd thing that could have sent Putin down the wrong path was the lack of blowback. Entering the war, it was unclear whether Putin would face serious repercussions if he were wrong about everything. Within the government, just about everyone was publicly on board with the war. No obvious challengers were around. The day after Putin told his generals to make final preparations for the war, Putin publicly convened a meeting of the Russian Security Council to decide whether to recognize the independence of Luhansk and Donetsk. Advisor after advisor after advisor after advisor stood in front of the cameras to declare their support for the war. Each of them became at least partially culpable for whatever would happen next. When director of the Foreign Intelligence Service Sergei Narishkin appeared to even slightly deviate from the party line, Putin hammered him. After a few awkward moments, including Narishkin suggesting that Russia outright annex Luhansk and Donetsk, which Putin reminded him was not yet the point of that meeting, Narishkin quickly got back onto message. He, just like everyone else, was now publicly on board. It got even better, at least for the Russian leader. As we have discussed before, public opinion of Putin, going into the war anyway, was fairly high, and now he had an endless supply of scapegoats if he ever wanted to pull out of the war. It's uncertain whether Putin can thread that needle and survive a losing effort, of course, but it's better for him to have that option than not. The fourth issue is the pandemic. Given the stakes, Putin naturally would have wanted to try to verify for himself as much information as he could. And with Putin already having gutted the institutions that should be doing that on his behalf, Putin's own effort here would have been a vital stopgap measure. The pandemic would have killed those plans. Apparently very worried about catching COVID, Putin limited his travel schedule. Prior to the pandemic, he frequently oversaw training exercises and visited military facilities. Had that continued during the pandemic, he might have spotted more cracks in the system. Instead, he stayed home. The final issue, and this is speculative, was Putin's health. There have been long-running rumors that Putin is struggling with some long-term and perhaps terminal illness. The publicly available evidence for this is scant, but it has been enough to get the rumor mill running. Shortly after the war began, people noticed that Putin adopted a habit of grabbing tables with his right hand. The speculation is that he is trying to control a tremble or relieve pain by engaging his muscles. There was also some foot tapping for good measure. During the pandemic, he would sit across from other world leaders at this giant table, as seen in these February 7th, 2022 photos of the final pre-war negotiations between East and West. He was also very far away from everyone during that fateful Security Council meeting. The extreme caution was perhaps due to concerns about comorbidities should he catch COVID. Going back further, another piece of the theory is Putin's development of moon-shaped face, named because people see a comparison to the man-shaped craters on the moon. Regardless of the quality of that naming convention, this type of bloating can be the result of hormone therapy. Something there has definitely changed over time, as seen in comparison to this 2014 photo. But he is also just getting older. Hey, maybe he's developed a taste for ice cream in his golden years. The longest-running health concern has been in how he walks, with a limp on his right side. Here it is subtle. Some describe this as a gunslinger's gait, and that he learned to walk this way as a KGB agent to keep his hand closer to his sidearm. Other times, the limp is more pronounced. If we go back to the start of that Security Council meeting, you can see it there as well. I went down a rabbit hole on this one, and as far as I can tell, all of the reports trace back to a single article in the British Medical Journal that developed the theory. That, in turn, cites a KGB handbook that has a chapter on agent movement. It does indeed have a chapter that recommends specific ways to move. And there is some language about limiting swinging movement to your left side to keep a weapon ready on your right side. But the advice comes under the subheading of Special Features of Night Movement, and the chapter more generally describes what to do in open theaters of combat. It's full of diagrams on how to deal with things like barbed wire. It is not a recommendation on how to walk under normal circumstances. And that would make sense. Could you imagine if all the KGB agents in Washington, D.C. walked that way? The FBI would have them all arrested within a day. So a face, a gait, and a hand with maybe a foot. Like I said, this is incredibly speculative. And to be clear, I am not a physician. Moreover, no physician would tell you that it is possible to make a real diagnosis by looking at photos and videos. But if he were sick, it would make sense of the miscalculation. The more time he was seeking treatment and recovering, the less time he could dedicate to talking to advisors and auditing the intelligence reports given to him. In any case, some combination of those 5 problems created the perfect storm for conflict. Ukraine thought that the expected outcome of the war would be favorable for it. Putin thought that the expected outcome of war would be favorable for him. And sure enough, 4 days after giving his generals final clearance, Russia invaded Ukraine. If you want to know more about the invasion, including more on the miscalculation and lines on maps, you will love my book that examines the causes of it. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Okay, I swear this is a coincidence, but last time we discussed the Soviet Union's Buran space shuttle program. This time around, I had the word cakewalk in the script, so naturally I started searching for Putin with a cake. Mission accomplished here. But look a little closer at that cake. It's the Buran. And to have a little more fun with photos, take a look at this woman to the left of Putin, from a photo shoot for Putin's 2023 New Year's message. There is speculation that she was also the woman selling ice cream to Putin during an air show in 2017. What do you think? Regardless, it makes you wonder what else might be randomly, or intentionally, showing up in these pictures.